The United States Navy submarine service had the highest casualty rate of any branch of the American Armed Forces in World War II, higher than the Marine Corps, higher than the carrier pilots, higher than the infantry who crossed the beach at Normandy. The men who carried that distinction were the ones who climbed down the hatches of Gato and Balao-class submarines, sealed themselves inside, and drove those machines into waters the Imperial Japanese Navy considered its own. 1 in 5 did not come back. Of the roughly 300 submarines the Navy sent into combat across the Pacific, 52 never returned, most of them going down with their entire crews, 70 to 80 men each, in water so deep and so far from any shore that the word missing on the casualty form meant exactly what it said. Today you are going to find out what those men actually lived through. Not the recruiting version, not the version where submarines are sleek, and the crew is clean, and everything works. The real version. And stay until the end, because what happened on October 24th, 1944, to the most successful American submarine of the entire war, the boat that had already sunk 31 enemy ships, is something most people have never heard, and it changes everything about what you think you know about the silent service. The submarine itself is where the story has to begin, because the machine shaped everything that happened inside it, and the machine was unlike anything the men who served on it had encountered in any other context of their lives. A Gato-class submarine measured 311 feet from bow to stern, which sounds substantial until you understand that inside that length, between 60 and 80 men lived, ate, worked, and tried to sleep for patrols that ran 60 to 75 days, not on a ship with a deck you could walk on, but inside a steel cylinder, underwater, in the Pacific Ocean, in wartime. The pressure hull, the steel tube that kept the ocean out, was 16 feet across at its widest point, with 3/4 of an inch of high-tensile steel separating the crew from water pressure that at 300 feet would crush an unprotected human body instantly. The men knew this number, not because the Navy told them, but because at depth the hull told them directly. The steel plates visibly pushing inward under external pressure, the frames groaning in ways that carried clearly through the entire boat. An experienced man could tell the difference between 200 feet and 300 feet by what he heard under his boots on the deck plates, and this was not a skill the training establishment had taught him. The boat was divided into 6 compartments: forward torpedo room, forward battery and officer quarters, control room, crew berthing, engine rooms, after torpedo room, each connected to the next by a circular hatch you had to duck and step through simultaneously, then dog shut behind you by hand. 14 men slept in the forward torpedo room, their bunks folded out from between the reload torpedoes. Pull the frame out, sleep, fold it back when the torpedo men needed the space to work, which meant that a man going to sleep in the forward torpedo room had his face approximately 3 feet from a warhead containing several hundred pounds of high explosive, a fact that was not a secret and was not hidden from the crew, but was simply the arithmetic of a machine designed to carry maximum weapons in minimum volume, with the crew as the variable adjusted to make the numbers work. Each man on the boat was allocated 1 cubic foot of personal storage space, 1 cubic foot for everything that was not the uniform on his back. And so photographs went between pipes, letters were folded small enough to fit inside a jacket pocket, and whatever would not compress, a watch or a ring, went into the gap between a pipe and the hull, where the warmth kept things dry while condensation ran down every cold surface in the boat. Condensation was constant, because the hull in cold Pacific water was significantly colder than the air inside the boat, warmed by engines, electronics, and the body heat of 80 men. And warm air against cold metal produces water that ran down the bulkheads, pooled in the bilges, and soaked into the bread stored in mesh bags in the torpedo room, which developed mold within the first 2 weeks of every patrol. The policy was to cut the mold off and eat what remained. But moldy bread and wet bunks were not what submariners feared most. because what they feared was connected to the thing sitting 3 feet from their faces in the torpedo room. And that fear had a very specific reason that gets to the center of this story. But first you need to understand what daily life on these boats actually cost before any Japanese ship appeared on the horizon. The watch rotation was officially 4 hours on, 8 hours off, which sounds manageable until you understand what those 8 hours off actually contained, because they were not 8 hours of sleep, but 8 hours during which sleep was theoretically possible, interrupted by battle stations, maintenance requirements, the general quarters alarm that sent every man to his post, regardless of where he was in his rest cycle, and the ambient noise of a machine that never fully quieted, the pumps cycling, the ventilation fans running, the hull settling against whatever pressure surrounded it at the current depth. The men adapted by sleeping in fragments, 2 hours here, 40 minutes there, whatever the boat permitted. And over the course of a 60-day patrol, the accumulated sleep deficit produced a specific kind of exhaustion that veterans described not as tiredness, but as a permanent alteration in the texture of consciousness, a state in which the world felt slightly removed from full reality, which was a physiological condition and not a psychological one, caused by sleep architecture disrupted over too many weeks for the brain to fully compensate. There was one man whose job made the sleep problem worse than it was for everyone else, and that was the sound operator. The sailor who sat with headphones pressed to his ears, listening to the ocean through the boat's passive sonar equipment for hours at a time, in a compartment kept acoustically isolated from the rest of the boat so that he could hear what the hydrophones were picking up without interference from the boat's own machinery. What the sound operator listened for, above everything else, was the signature of destroyer propellers, the specific rhythmic beat of a warship's screws transmitted through the water at ranges of miles, which he had been trained to identify and to characterize not just as present or absent, but as closing or opening, fast or slow, bearing left or right, because those distinctions told the captain whether the boat needed to maneuver immediately or whether there was still time to think. A sound operator who was tired made mistakes, heard contacts that were not there, or more dangerously dismissed faint contacts as noise. And so the sound operators were, in theory, the most carefully protected members of the crew in terms of rest, given priority in the bunk rotation, and kept off supplementary duty assignments because the quality of their listening was the earliest warning system the boat possessed, and the earliest warning system was the difference between time to maneuver and no time at all. American fleet submarines were equipped with air conditioning, a fact that distinguished them from nearly every other submarine in the world at that point in the war, and the Navy had installed it not out of generosity, but out of a cold institutional calculation. Running 80 men through a 60-day patrol in tropical Pacific water without it would produce a crew that was physically incapacitated before the patrol was half complete. When the boat submerged, which was most of every daylight period in Japanese-controlled waters, the diesel engine shut down and the air conditioning ran on battery power, and as the patrol progressed and the batteries cycled, as the machinery spaces heated and the bodies of 80 men added warmth to a sealed container, the system struggled against a thermal load. It had not been designed to manage indefinitely. Engine room temperatures during tropical operations regularly exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and that heat moved forward through the boat until berthing compartment temperatures during submerged operations ran above 90 degrees. Conditions that the aviation medicine literature of the period classified as occupationally dangerous for the men who maintained equipment, ran attack solutions, and tracked contacts across 6-hour watches. The uniform adapted accordingly, because regulations specified dungarees and work shirts, but the reality modified this in ways the regulations acknowledged only after the fact. Men stood watch in cut-off shorts and sandals, some wore nothing above the waist, and senior chiefs who would have required proper uniform on any surface ship said nothing because they were also in cut-off shorts. And the Navy, confronted with the photographs, updated the regulations. In Japanese-controlled waters, the boat surfaced only after dark, ran the diesels to recharge the batteries, and dove again before first light, and the crew adapted to this inversion by flipping their entire daily schedule, sleeping during the daylight submergence, running the boat's routines at night, a practice they called going reversa, which they maintained for weeks at a time, without any biological cue for when to be awake or asleep. The physiological effect of living on that inverted schedule, in a container where the artificial light never changed, and no sunrise or sunset marked the passage of time, was something the Navy's medical staff documented at length and largely could not address, because the fatigue it produced was not the kind that rest alone could correct. And the men stood their watches anyway. There was one compensation the Navy had decided to offer: a calculated institutional decision, because if you were asking men to seal themselves inside a metal container and drive it into enemy waters for 2 months, the least you could do was feed them well. And so American submariners ate better than any other branch of the armed forces, leaving port loaded with steaks, fresh eggs, vegetables, and fruit, served by cooks working galleys the size of large closets who produced meals that sailors on surface ships specifically requested transfers to submarine service to access for the first 2 weeks. After that, the fresh stores were gone, and the rest of the patrol ran on canned goods, dried provisions, and frozen stores that had been loaded at departure into every available space: the showers, the engine room bilges, stacked in passageways until the crew had eaten enough to create walking room, because a 60 to 75-day patrol demanded more food than the designated storage spaces could hold, and the solution was to store it everywhere else. Ice cream freezers were standard equipment on American fleet submarines, and they were empty within the first week. The medical situation on these boats was handled by one man who was not a doctor, the pharmacist's mate, a naval rating whose training was considerably below the level of a physician, but who was the sole medical authority for every man on the boat for the entire duration of the patrol, responsible for every injury, illness, dental emergency, and psychological crisis that arose in a steel container 60 feet underwater and several thousand miles from the nearest hospital. Appendicitis was the problem that kept submarine medical officers awake at training establishments, because an inflamed appendix could not wait for the boat to return to port and could not be fully addressed by the pharmacist's mate's level of training. And yet it happened. And when it did, the boat faced a choice between surfacing in enemy waters to transfer the man to a surface vessel, if one could be reached, or attempting to address the situation with the equipment and training on hand, which in at least one documented case meant a pharmacist's mate performing an emergency appendectomy on a wardroom table with guidance provided by a physician via radio from Pearl Harbor, while the boat ran submerged at periscope depth to avoid Japanese air patrols. The operation succeeded, the patient survived, and the pharmacist's mate received a commendation. And when you read the citation, which describes the procedure in the careful understatement of naval administrative language, what comes through is that the man who performed it had been trained to treat seasickness and minor wounds, and had done something substantially beyond that because the circumstances required it. And there was no one else. On December 8, 1941, the day after Pearl Harbor, American submarines went to war carrying the Mark 14 torpedo, which was the most advanced anti-ship weapon in the United States Navy. It ran on steam, could travel over 5 miles, hit speeds approaching 50 miles per hour, and was designed to detonate beneath a ship's hull, rather than against its side, where the explosion would rupture the keel and break the vessel in two. On paper, it was decisive, and in the hands of trained crews in Japanese waters, it was supposed to change the character of the Pacific War within months. But it didn't work. The Mark 14 had not been properly tested before the war, because money was tight during the Depression, and the Bureau of Ordnance had made a decision that would cost American submariners years of effective operations. The torpedo's depth-setting mechanism had been calibrated using dummy warheads that were lighter than the real weapon, which meant the mechanism had been set for a torpedo that weighed less than the one the men were actually firing. The Mark 14 ran 11 feet deeper than set, which meant that a torpedo aimed to pass 10 feet beneath a ship's keel ran 21 feet deep and passed underneath the target entirely. A single defect that probably allowed hundreds of Japanese ships to survive the first 2 years of the war. Submarine commanders fired spreads of torpedoes at Japanese vessels and watched them miss targets that the geometry of the attack made impossible to miss. They fired at anchored ships sitting motionless in the water and recorded duds. They returned to Pearl Harbor, filed detailed reports, and the Bureau of Ordnance reviewed those reports and blamed the submarine commanders. Poor seamanship, faulty approach technique, crew error. For nearly a year, the official position of the United States Navy's primary weapons development office was that its highest casualty rate service was missing stationary targets because the men were bad at their jobs, a position that Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of Submarine Forces Pacific Fleet, refused to accept, ordering his own test in mid-1942, firing Mark 14 torpedoes fitted with net-catching devices into underwater nets at Fremantle, Western Australia. The nets confirmed what the commanders had been reporting, and Lockwood took his findings to the Bureau of Ordnance, which corrected the depth-setting mechanism, fixing problem 1 of 3. Because even when the torpedo ran at the correct depth, the magnetic exploder was firing prematurely, triggered by the ship's magnetic field at a distance too great to cause damage, so that the crew heard the explosion, checked the periscope, and watched the target sailing on untouched. Lockwood deactivated the magnetic exploder fleet-wide and ordered contact detonation only, which exposed problem 3. The contact firing pin was too fragile for direct hits, because on a perfect shot at 90 degrees to the target, the deceleration force when the torpedo struck the hull was sufficient to crush the firing pin before it could fire, while a glancing hit had a better chance of functioning, meaning the better the shot, the more likely it was to produce a dud. The United States Navy had spent years and considerable money developing a torpedo that failed most reliably when the Submariner fired it perfectly. On July 24, 1943, the submarine USS Tang found a sitting duck, the Japanese whale factory ship Tonin Maru No. 3, 19,000 tons, dead in the water, alone, without escort, not moving, and Lieutenant Commander Daspit set up a textbook approach and fired 15 Mark 14 torpedoes, 12 of which hit the target and 1 of which exploded. Tonin Maru No. 3 sailed away, and Daspit returned to Pearl Harbor with his last torpedo unfired, preserved as evidence, walking into Lockwood's office nearly speechless with rage, and Lockwood ordered immediate testing. 11 contact exploders were fired at a cliff face and dropped from a crane, and the firing pins collapsed on direct impact every time. By September of 1943, 21 months after Pearl Harbor, the contact exploder had finally been redesigned using firing pins machined from scrapped aircraft propellers, and they worked. 21 months. Every man who served on an American fleet submarine in 1942 and into 43 carried this knowledge with him on every patrol, diving into Japanese waters with weapons he could not fully trust, approaching targets at ranges that cost battery power and placed him inside the coverage arc of enemy escorts, setting up attacks that required hours of careful work under real danger, firing, watching the weapons fail, reloading, and trying again. The men who ran those attacks understood the geometry of what they were doing in a way that the casualty statistics alone cannot convey, because approaching a Japanese convoy was not a single decision made at a distance, but a sequence of decisions made over hours, each one incrementally committing the boat to a position from which withdrawal became progressively more difficult, requiring the captain to hold the approach long enough to fire while the escorts were still outside their detection range, knowing that the margin between the moment he fired and the moment the escorts located the periscope, wake was measured in seconds, not minutes. Commander Dudley Morton of USS Wahoo had a philosophy he stated plainly to his crew before his first war patrol in command. The Wahoo is expendable, and we will expend ourselves if we can take a Japanese ship with us, which was not bravado, but a statement of the operational calculus he had decided to apply, and which his crew understood when he surfaced the Wahoo in daylight to pursue a damaged Japanese destroyer at close range in January of 1943, an action that no doctrine supported and no training had prepared anyone to execute, but which ended with the destroyer on the bottom and Wahoo undamaged. Morton's approach spread through the submarine force not through official doctrine, but through the informal networks of men who served under him and then took their own commands. And Richard O'Kane, who had been Morton's executive officer on Wahoo before taking command of Tang, carried Morton's philosophy with him so completely that O'Kane's own patrol reports read in places like operational poetry, because he had found a way to make the service's formal language express what was actually happening inside the attacks. What was actually happening, across the patrol reports that survive, was that the submarine force developed a body of practical tactical knowledge the pre-war training establishment had not possessed. Knowledge about the behavior of Japanese escort commanders under different attack geometries, about which evasion patterns tended to open the range from a searching escort and which tended to close it, about the intervals between depth charge patterns that an experienced captain could use to maneuver. Knowledge that was the cumulative product of patrols in which men died learning it, and which the survivors passed forward through their patrol reports and through conversations at the Pearl Harbor submarine base between one crew finishing a patrol and another preparing to begin. One submarine would survive all of this: the bad torpedoes, the depth charges, the mathematics of loss that every man had performed standing on the dock before departure, and go on to become the most successful American submarine of the entire war, only to be destroyed by its own weapon. But before that story, you need to understand what a depth charge attack actually did to the men inside a boat, because it was the other half of what submarine service cost. A depth charge detonating within 50 feet of a Gato-class submarine was not necessarily lethal, but it was, without exception, catastrophic in what it did to the men inside, because the shock wave transmitted through the water and into the hull was not experienced as an explosion in the open-air sense, but as the boat being struck simultaneously from every direction by something with the mass and force of the ocean itself. Light bulbs shattered throughout the boat, cork insulation dislodged from the bulkheads and filled every compartment with a dense, choking powder that mixed with the condensation already in the air. Gauges broke, equipment flew, and men who were not braced were thrown. And then the attack was not over. The engineering watch moved through every compartment. A slow seep at a valve packing was survivable, but a fast flood through a structural rupture at depth was not, because the pumps had been designed for operational leakage and not for the rate at which deep water under pressure entered through a failed hull. The men who performed this damage assessment did it in the dark. The light bulbs had shattered, in a boat that might still be descending, because the depth control planes had jammed, breathing air thickening with cork dust, and, depending on the battery condition, the first traces of chlorine gas from cells cracked by the concussion, and they did it with flashlights. Above them, audible through the hull to every man in the boat, were the propellers of the Japanese escort that had just dropped the pattern, and the specific sound those propellers made as the escort turned for another run told the sound operator, and through him the captain, whether the next pattern was seconds away or minutes, and that distinction was the information the captain needed to decide whether to go deeper, which cost battery power and increased hull stress, or to hold position and wait. There was a specific phase of a depth charge attack that veterans described as the worst, not the moment of the explosion itself, which was violent and disorienting but finite, but the waiting between patterns when the boat ran silent and the crew was ordered to minimum movement, when non-essential equipment was shut down to reduce the acoustic signature, when the sound operator tracked the escort's propellers and reported their bearing every 30 seconds, and when the men at their stations or in their bunks had nothing to do but wait and listen and think. Thinking was the enemy in those intervals, or more precisely, the kind of thinking that had no operational output, because the calculations a man could perform lying in his bunk, while the escort searched overhead, simply arrived at the same set of numbers they always arrived at, the same assessment of probability that every man on the boat had already made, and the only thing that interrupted them was either the sound operator reporting that the escort was opening range, or the dull distant thud of the next pattern entering the water above. The men who survived multiple attacks described an evolution in how they experienced them. The first attack produced recognizable fear, while subsequent ones produced a trained capacity to perform the required actions. Check the gauges, report the readings, execute the evasive maneuver, while the cognitive processing of what was happening ran on a separate track that did not interfere with the operational one. This adaptation was not uniform and could be lost, reversed by a single severe attack that reminded the nervous system what the earlier attacks had been building a tolerance to. But in its developed form, it was the specific quality that made an experienced submarine crew measurably different from a new one, and it was the quality that the loss of 52 boats permanently removed from the force, requiring it to be rebuilt from the beginning in each replacement crew. Robert Hunt was a torpedo man aboard USS Tang who served 12 consecutive war patrols, and he said near the end of his life that by his third patrol he had reached a simple conclusion, that he was going to die on a submarine. And having done the mathematics of loss rates and operational tempo, he decided it would probably be fast, found this acceptable, and went back on patrol 9 more times. That was not unusual. That was the silent service. What the Navy's leadership understood, and what the historical record confirms, was that the men who had reached Hunt-specific accommodation with probability, the ones who had completed the internal calculation, accepted the answer, and filed it somewhere that did not interfere with their daily function, were the most effective submarine crew members the service had, because they were operating without the interference that unresolved fear produces. And the question the service faced throughout the war was how to create conditions that allowed this accommodation to develop before the boat was lost, which was a question it never fully answered, but which shaped every aspect of the submarine training pipeline from the point at which the casualty rates became impossible to ignore. 263 American submarines conducted war patrols during the Pacific War, representing approximately 1.5% of total United States Navy personnel, and those submarines sank 54.5% of all Japanese shipping lost during the entire conflict. Japan was an island nation at war, which meant that every ton of steel in its factories, every barrel of oil in its ships and aircraft, every pound of rice eaten by its soldiers, moved by sea, and the Japanese merchant fleet that began the war with approximately 6 million tons of shipping capacity was being systematically destroyed from the first day and never recovered. By 1944, the rate of sinking exceeded anything Japanese shipyards could replace, so that by late that year, entire Japanese fleet sat idle at anchor because there was not enough fuel oil to move them. The tankers that should have carried that fuel were on the bottom of the Pacific, and the supply ships that should have fed the garrisons on Guadalcanal and Tarawa and Iwo Jima could not get through. American submarines sank more than 1,400 Japanese ships and accounted for 30% of total Japanese naval losses across every category, including USS Archerfish's destruction of the fleet carrier Shinano in November 1944, the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine on Shinano's maiden voyage. They accomplished all of this while losing 52 boats and 3,500 men, not 350,000, but 3,500, meaning the United States lost fewer men in its entire submarine force over 4 years than it lost in the first morning at Omaha Beach. That ratio between what the submarine service cost and what it accomplished was precisely what the Japanese High Command had failed to calculate in 1941. They had seen what German U-boats were doing to British shipping. They knew what submarines could do, but their own submarine force had been built around fleet doctrine rather than commerce rating, and they had never modeled what it would mean to face an enemy whose submarines had the opposite mission. The answer to that miscalculation arrived at the rate of 1 Japanese merchant ship every 36 hours. October 24, 1944, the Taiwan Strait and USS Tang, a Balao-class submarine under Lieutenant Commander Richard O'Kane, had been at sea for 31 days on her 5th war patrol, during which she had fired 23 of her 24 torpedoes, 22 of which had found enemy ships and sent 13 vessels to the bottom. Richard O'Kane was, at that moment, the most successful submarine commander in the United States Navy, a man who had learned his trade under Dudley Morton on the USS Wahoo, the relentless and aggressive Morton who had remade American submarine tactics through sheer force of what the service called fighting spirit before taking command of Tang and building across 5 patrols a record that Morton's own achievements could not match. 31 ships, and no American submarine had come close. The 5th patrol had begun in September of 1944, and in its first weeks, Tang had attacked 2 separate convoys in the Formosa Strait, sinking ships in both engagements and evading the escort response each time, and the patrol reports from those attacks described the geometry of the approaches and the behavior of the Japanese escorts with the same dispassionate precision O'Kane applied to everything, a precision that makes them read, in retrospect, like accounts written by a man who did not know what the last day of that patrol was about to look like. He had 1 torpedo left, and there was a damaged Japanese transport nearby. Wounded, not sunk, so O'Kane brought Tang to the surface, positioned the boat, and fired. The torpedo left the tube. It ran straight for approximately 100 yards. Then it curved left. A faulty gyroscope had produced a circular run, the failure mode that torpedo technicians had feared since the Mark 18 electric torpedo entered service, sending the weapon on a wide arc back toward the boat that fired it, and the torpedo hit Tang in the after torpedo room 20 seconds after launch. Tang went down in 180 feet of water, and of the 87 men aboard, 9 survived. The 9 who made it out included the men blown from the bridge into the water and a group who escaped through the forward escape trunk, flooding the compartment to equalize pressure, forcing the hatch open against the weight of the ocean above, and swimming upward through 180 feet of dark water while managing the decompression of the ascent, in air already contaminated with chlorine gas from battery cells flooded by the sinking. Some of them burned, some concussed, all of them doing something that submarine escape training had described in theory, but that no training scenario had fully reproduced. 5 of those 8 men who entered the water reached the surface. 3 did not. O'Kane was on the bridge when the torpedo hit and was thrown into the Taiwan Strait, where a Japanese escort vessel pulled him from the water the following morning. The men who fought their way out of the sinking boat through chlorine gas and darkness at 180 feet were picked up by the same Japanese vessels and taken to the same prison camps, where they spent the remainder of the war alongside their commanding officer. O'Kane was awarded the Medal of Honor for the final 2 patrols of Tang's career, the same patrols that ended with his own torpedo sinking his boat and killing 78 of his men. And for nearly a year after the war ended, the full story was not public until a surviving crew member, Lieutenant Lawrence Savadkin, speaking to a journalist in Guam on his way home in September 1945, finally said it plainly. He said, "We were surface trailing a convoy in shallow water, and I was in the conning tower when the torpedo hit, and it was like the world coming to an end. The silent service lost 1 in 5 of the men who served in it. 52 submarines, 3,500 men, in water the Navy knows the coordinates of and cannot reach. And in that same war, 1.5% of the Navy's total personnel destroyed more than half of everything Japan lost at sea." The torpedo problem was eventually fixed, the boats got better, and the crews that survived long enough learned what no training could teach. The sounds the hull made at 300 feet, the interval between a depth charge's first impact and its detonation that told an experienced commander whether the attack was close or whether there were still seconds to maneuver. Knowledge they passed forward to new crews, who turned the patrol reports into doctrine and sent the doctrine out on the next boat, and the boats kept going out. Robert Hunt, who did 12 patrols on Tambor and decided on his 3rd that he was going to die, was asked years later why he kept going back, and he thought about it for a long time before he said that he went back because the boat needed him, not because he believed he would survive, not because of the recruiting version or the flag or any of the things that are easier to say, but because the boat needed him, and the crew was the boat, and the boat was the crew, and there was nothing else to discuss. Most American submariners never saw the boat that sank them. The men aboard USS Tang did. That is the silent service. If this story stayed with you, subscribe. There are more of these, and the next one is already coming.